And here we go again with another lesson related to the Hebrew verbal system. In two previous lessons, I've spent some time talking about the concepts of the verb system related to the root, the stem, the state, and then the person, number, and gender. And then I put that into some practical application where we talked about the Qal Perfect and how those forms then are derived. And so today what we want to do is go ahead and look at the imperfect and begin seeing if we can understand how to put that into the various forms. Just as a quick reminder, we're talking primarily about the four elements of the root, the stem, the state, and the person, number, and gender. Person, gender, and number, sometimes referred to as just number and gender. The root, we're meaning the three consonants that make up the primary, most basic form of the verb. This is what you will also then look the verb up in the dictionary. The stem is going to be that movement of intensity all the way from the call to the hitpael. And the hitpael is the intensive reflexive. So the further you move along this scale, you're going to become more intensive to causative with the hifil hofal, and then the hitpael is going to be the intensive reflexive. When we talk about state, we sometimes use this word tense, though that's not the most adequate word to use for the Hebrew understanding, because we're not talking about past, present, or future when we're talking about tense, or at least state in the Hebrew. We're talking about primarily action, and that is very key in terms of perfect being a complete action, imperfect being an incomplete action, the imperative being an action, command, etc. Person, gender, and number, for example, we mean third masculine singular or second feminine plural, depending upon the way the verb is actually formed. This chart is something you're already familiar with, but just to give it to you, just to glance at it, conceptually it helps you kind of put it all together in terms of the movements of the stems from less intensive to more intensive, with causative intensive to intensive reflexive. And then, of course, we have on this side the perfect, imperfect, imperative, participle, and the infinitive, the primary ways in which these verbs are then delineated under state. Then the box in the middle, of course, just reminds us about proformatives and affirmatives and vowel changes and how that designates the number and the gender, as well as the stem and the state. Let me kind of walk us through how this is actually going to play out. I'm putting in place these X's. These are representative of any of the Hebrew consonants. Those are not Hebrew consonants themselves. This is just a placeholder. And remember that we have primarily the three positions, 1, 2, and 3. This is modeled by the Hebrew verb pa'al. The pay is the first position, the ayin is the second position, and the third position is going to be the lamed. To understand or to represent then the inflection of the verb or the changes that are necessary, there are three primary things that are going to occur. And the first is potentially proformatives. These are syllables that are placed on the beginning of the verb form or the verb root. The second are the affirmatives. These likewise are syllables that are placed onto the end of the verbal root. And then we will have internally what we call vowel changes. And these three different categories of things, three different change elements, are what give us the designation of Qal Imperfect, third masculine singular, third feminine singular, second masculine, all the way down to first common plural. So once you get that kind of in your mind, that to the root you're adding either a proformative or you're adding an affirmative or you're doing a vowel change internally, that will go a long way toward helping you identify the parsing values or the analyzing of the root. And the most important thing to recognize is that if you learn the Qal Perfect and the Qal Imperfect, then all of the other stems will be much more easy to delineate, because you will look for differences in the vowel changes, the proformatives, the affirmatives, and you will see those vowel changes and those other elements will easily identify for you whether you're talking about a Qal, a nifal, a pl, a pual, the hifil hofal, or the hitpael. It'll become like second nature once you get the Qal down and then learn the differences. Now let me walk you through the understanding of how the imperfect then is going to be formed. Notice that to the root, 1, 2, the 3 consonants, 1, 2, 3, we're going to add the proformative. There's only a handful of them. Yod, Tav, notice we have Tav, Tav repeated. The Aleph, then Yod again, Tav, 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 and the Nun. So we're only talking about 4 consonants. The first is the Yod, then we have the Tav, then we have the Aleph, and then we have the Nun. The good news is that once you recognize that this verb is actually an imperfect form, if you see these different consonants as proformatives, you're immediately going to be able to recognize person, number, and gender. Now let me explain that. The Yod is always going to represent third person. Now it may be, though, that this is going to be singular or plural depending upon the I formative, but regardless, the main thing to remember is that you're always going to be talking about third person, singular or plural. So when you see a Yod, you got to think third person. Now let's talk about the Aleph. We'll just drop down to it, because when you see it, it's always going to represent first person, common, singular. It's just the rule of thumb. It's the way it's going to be. And when you see the Nun on the imperfect form, especially of the Qal Imperfect, and then all the other imperfects, and there's a deviation of this on the Qal Perfect, but we'll come back to that. When you see the Nun on the imperfect form, it's always going to be first person, common, plural. So if you can identify that it's an imperfect form, you see the Yod, the Aleph, or the Nun, you're already halfway there toward analyzing the verb itself. And then the Tav is going to indicate to us, for instance, sometimes third person and sometimes second person, sometimes second person, depending upon the I formative that is attached to it. Or in this case, with the first 2, it's just the simple basic form. But I just want you to remember, on the imperfect, when we talk about proformatives, you really only have a handful to remember. And if you remember these 3, third person, first person, then you just have to figure out this last one, and it can be third or second person. So those are the proformatives. So now let's look at the I formatives. And you'll notice that in these first few forms, there really are no I formatives, but you begin to see them pop up here in the second feminine singular. Importantly, whereas in the Qal Perfect, the E sound on the end is going to indicate the first person, in the imperfect form, it's actually going to indicate second feminine singular. And then notice the U sound here, the I formative on the end of the third masculine plural, is going to indicate, again, third person masculine plural. Here it's going to indicate second masculine plural, but again, I formative. These are the syllables that are on the end. The Na and the Na, these 2 forms are exactly the same. So once you learn the one form, you've got it. You just need to recognize one is a third person and the other is a second person. And then on the last one, there is no I formative. So you only have just a handful of I formatives that you need to worry about, such as the E indicating second feminine singular. The U is going to indicate plural, so just keep that in mind, but it could be third plural or it could be second plural, depending on which way it's going to be. But it's always going to be masculine, so that's helpful. And then the Na that you see on the end is always going to indicate feminine, and it's either third or it's second. But if you get that Na sound in your mind and the U sound, then you're thinking masculine and feminine. While this seems perhaps a little confusing, the main thing to remember is that with the root, basically you're talking about the proformatives, the I formatives, and then the vowel changes, which we will look at now. So the basic form, Qal Imperfect, is going to be Yishmor. And here is the Hirik under the Yod, which is the I formatives, the proformatives that go all the way down. And then you have the O class vowel in the latter syllable. That's the form, Yishmor. Notice that the first 3 actually have a very, very similar sound. Yishmor, Tishmor, Tishmor. The difference, of course, is the Tav here, indicating that you have a movement from third person masculine singular to third feminine singular and then second masculine singular. Then you have Tishmori, and this is where you add on the I formative, but that also is going to change the internal vocalization here. It's going to make this first shava a silent shava. It's a syllable termination. And then you have a vocal shava that follows it. Then the latter syllable, Marie, Tish, Marie. The good news here, we go back to a little bit more of the simpler form Eshmor, but notice the vowel change here. Instead of the Hirik, it's going to change into the Segol, primarily because of the guttural. The aleph is a guttural. Yishmaru, Tishmorna, and with Tishmorna, notice that we have the return of the O-class vowel, and then the last syllable, Tishmorna. Tishmaru, Tishmorna, and Nishmor. So that's how we put this together with the Qal Imperfect. We have the proformatives, we have the I-formatives, and then we have the vowel changes. And the primary characteristic is going to be the Hirik with the Shava here, and then often the O-class vowel that is above in that second syllable. Primarily it's going to be in the second syllable, but when there is a third syllable that's added to the word with the I-formative, then that's going to disappear and it'll become the shava, the vocal shava, as you see. Let me pronounce these. Just listen the first time through, and then I will repeat them, giving you an opportunity to repeat them after me. Tishmor. Excuse me. Yishmor. Tishmor. Tishmor. Tishmarie. Eshmor. Yishmaru. Tishmorna. Tishmaru. Tishmorna. Nishmor. And one more time. Yishmor. Tishmor. Tishmor. Tishmarie. Eshmor. Yishmaru. Tishmorna. Tishmaru. Tishmorna. Nishmor. And this time, pronounce them after me. I'll give you a moment's pause for you to do so. Yishmor. Tishmor. Tishmor. Tishmarie. Eshmor. Yishmaru. Tishmorna. Tishmaru. Tishmorna. Nishmor. All right, I think that's going to get you going in terms of being able to understand how the imperfect is formed, the different I-formatives, proformatives, and the vowel changes. I cannot repeat enough. You have to memorize these very, very basic forms. The Qal perfect, the Qal imperfect, and even when we talk about the imperative and the infinitive and so forth, participle form, it's important to memorize those, but the Qal perfect and imperfect really are the primary ones. You've just got to nail it so that you can repeat them very quickly, and you will then be able to translate that into all the other formations of the different verb stems. So I hope that gets you a little bit further along the way. I will see you in the next video.